Hello and welcome to the video. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is known as mocap, also referred to as motion capture data. The reason we're doing this video is I want to dive deep into why games use motion capture data, how it's used, how it all works, the setup, and sort of like the advantages and disadvantages of motion capture, and sort of look into specific games and how they actually come up with animation data. Some games in the past didn't use motion capture data and then have recently gone into the motion capture side of things. Some games started off early, and you can see a night and day difference if a game has or hasn't used motion capture. And then towards the end of the video, I'm going to showcase how it's used myself. Let's give you a demonstration of what motion capture is. But before we get into all that, it's very important that we actually go back and understand, how did it all start? It didn't just come out of the blue. There's got to be some sort of like starting point as to where motion capture started. So we're going to go way back in time and we're going to have a look at the history of motion capture, going all the way back to 1832, surprisingly. When I looked into this and researched this, I was not expecting to go that far back, but here we are. We're going to go back in time, have a look at 1832. Alright, so 1832. Now, just before I make a start on this, there is going to be some names that I have no idea how to say, from, like, I'm talking people, and there's also some terminology that I have no clue how to say as I was researching into this, so please excuse it if I have it completely wrong. I'm going to butcher it, but just a word of warning before I start. Anyway, back to it. 1832, a physicist from Belgium named Joseph Plateau, that was an easy one, invented the Fianchetoscope. Just a side note, I don't understand why these people come up with great inventions and they come up with awful terminology or naming conventions. Anyway, the Fianchetoscope, which was made to produce fluid motion and continuous animation. His goal was to test the way our eyes and brains process a series of images as a continuous motion. The instrument comprises of two discs rotating in opposite directions. One disc is fitted with small windows and the other features the images. When the discs are turned at the right speed, the images display the illusion of motion. Now, Joseph Plateau initially studied law, but in 1829 his dissertation focused on light and vision. He researched into how people perceive images through their own eyes and how, for example, people can see raindrops as lines. From these findings, he then created the Fianchetoscope, or whatever it is, instrument. In the same year, an Austrian mathematician named Simon von Stamfer invented the stroboscope, that's an easy one, which was made for the exact same reason, creating motion, so animation. Both inventions were made independently, however, yet they operated on the same principle. They both had a spinning disc with evenly spaced images or drawings along the circumference of the disc. To view the images, the user would have to look through equally spaced slits on the disc. If the disc itself was spun rapidly, the user would be able to look into the slits and view the images in quick succession. Viewing it this way was the earliest form of what we call continuous motion animation. The key difference between both inventions was Plateau's featured a series of hand-drawn images, and the user would view the drawn animation through a mirror reflecting the images. Stamfer's device used a disc that was slotted and a separate disc with the displayed images, which was then viewed through the allotted slots. Okay, so fast forward 2 years, 1834, British mathematician William George Horner created the first iteration of the zoetrope. Horner named it the Deladium, I hope I said that right, which came from the Greek myth of Deladius. To view this animation, the user would look into the slits which were between the pictures in what's called a revolving drum. 33 years later, in 1867, an American called William Lincoln patented the name zoetrope, which is more commonly known today. Soon after, a board game company named Milton Bradley began selling the zoetrope in both America and the United Kingdom. Children in the Victorian days loved playing with this new toy as they could see animated images moving of things like horses and other animals. After this, a giant zoetrope, which was 50 foot in circumference, was on display in the concert hall of the Crystal Palace in London, which was powered by gas engine. Push forward 1 year, English mathematician John Barnes Linnet patented an invention called the kinograph, which is known to be one of the earliest forms of what's called flipbook animation. This was a simple thing that consisted of images, either photographed or illustrated, and they were arranged into order and bound together to create a sequence. When the user flips through the pages, the images then show and appear to be moving, creating the illusion of animation. Even in today's digital age, this method of animation is commonly, I should know how to say that, used for simple animation. In 1872, Leland Stanford asked a photographer, Edward Muybridge, going to go with it, to settle an argument around whether a trotting horse lifts all 4 feet off the ground. He came up with a way to make high-speed photography using 12 cameras. Using the cameras, he pointed them at a horse track marked with vertical lines, and as the horse trotted along, it would trigger the electromagnetic shutter by breaking thin threads as the horse passed. This then proved that human vision could not fully see what movement the horses are making at such a fast speed. Okay, so in 1877, the praxinoscope was invented by Charles Emile Reynaud. The device consists of a cylinder and a paper strip on the inner surface of a spinning cylinder. The praxinoscope was an upgrade from the zoetrope by replacing the narrow viewing slits with the inner circle being small mirrors. These mirrors were placed strategically in the center so that reflections appeared more stationary. This would then give the viewer a brighter and more clearer view of the picture. Moving forward a little bit to 1882, a French qualified doctor named Etienne Jules Marie saw the work that Edward Muybridge managed to discover and wanted to push it further as he saw the medical potential of high-speed photography. Marley invented a photographic gun which was used to capture human and animal movements like birds. And birds naturally move very fast. So again, similar to like the horse, it's going to be quite difficult to sort of capture lifelike movement. But this gun had a revolving cylinder with photographic plates, so he could easily aim at his target and shoot. He later then developed his own camera, which is commonly known as the chronophotographic camera. While in Paris, he would photograph subjects performing moves, one being a jumping man, and from this, using this new camera, he could take exact measurements and replicate it. This process fixed a series of images onto a single plate with a rotating disc shutter. This allowed multiple images of objects to be displayed. He would need to have subjects wearing black clothing with white marks along the subject's limbs, which allowed him to focus on movement changes. And just a side note, this sort of like shows like an early form of what we see in mocap days now, where a lot of mocap suits have sort of like sensors, like maybe you've got the little balls on the clothing or something on there. This was sort of like the first sort of like thing that you can actually find where that practice is used. Okay, so moving forward now to 1891, almost out of the 80s. A name you've heard about, I'm sure, is Thomas Edison, famous for the electric light bulb. Another area you may or may not know about is he worked on the phonograph, which is a device to store sound waves and play it back to the user, which, you know, has obviously gone down its own sort of like modernization, as we know. But not many people know that he also deserves credit for inventing what's called the kinetoscope. And he invented this alongside William Kennedy Dixon. The kinetoscope was a device that the user would look into through a small peephole at strip of film and see short motion pictures. So with this, Edison and his team produced motion pictures in its earliest form. These included short films like The Blacksmith Scene in 1893 and Fred Ott's Sneeze in 1894, and these films were created for the kinetoscope. However, in 1895, the kinetoscope faced some competition from the Lumiere brothers as they invented the They invented the cinematograph, which could show motion pictures to larger audiences. This was the beginning of what we know as cinemas today. The cinematograph, was a camera, a printer, and a projector all in one, and was shown to a paying audience in December of 1895. So now we've reached, finally, the 1900s. So this was the start of many animated films. Now these films were small, but for the time were revolutionary, and the following films were made in the early years of the 1900s. I'm just going to quickly list some of these films. The Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, which was in 1906, created by J. Stuart Blackton. You got The Haunted Hotel in 1907, which again was created by the same person. This was for more of like a comedy/storytelling approach. There's another one, Japanese name. I'm going to attempt this, but I'm going to absolutely butcher this one. Katsudo Sashin, sure. 1907, which is Japanese animation, which was one of the first forms of animation within Japan. Then you got Phantasmagoria, which was created by Emile Call a friend. I'm sorry, but like some of these names are just absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, he was a French cartoonist, and he featured hand-drawn animations. And then you've got, that's an easy, Gertie the Dinosaur in 1914, created by Winsor McKay. It's like a nice, friendly dinosaur named Gertie, and it just showed like advancement within character animations for that time. And what McKay would do is he would interact with the animal or the animated dinosaur on stage, and he sort of like combined live action and animation together. In 1918, you had The Sinking of Louisiana, again by McKay. And then in 1919, Felix the Cat, which was created by Otto Mesmer. Okay, moving on to 1915, an American animator named Max Fleischer invented rotoscoping. This was an early way to add realistic movement to animated characters by using real-life action footage and painting over each individual frame by hand. By tracing over actors' movements, animators could easily capture natural human motion and then replicate it within animation. He did this by having a live-action film of his brother in a clown costume on a glass panel, and then traced over his movements frame by frame on paper to create a more lifelike style animation. From this, he made a short film series named Out of the Inkwell, which featured the animations of his brother as the famous known character Coco the Clown. This was produced from sort of like 1918 up to about 1929, and then he'd go on to make classic characters like Popeye and Betty Boop from the 1930s onwards. After his patent was over, however, Walt Disney then came in and used the same approach and technique of rotoscoping and made the well-known feature-length film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Okay, so we're going to move on to 1959. So the real first example of mocap can be found back to this point, where an American animator, Lee Harris III, created what's known as a bodysuit. This bodysuit had resistors that were adjustable, and this allowed recording of actors' movement. He experimented animating figures using analog circuits and what's known as the cathode ray tube, CRT for short. From this, he created the first motion capture rig, which was animated in real time on his CRT screen. So, in 1967, he created what's known as the Stickman. This was shot on his system, which was known as the Animax system. The line segments were controlled by the adjustable resistors, which are also known as pedentometers, maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, and were linked to each other in some almost like a tree structure style of things. Moving on to the 1980s, in the 1980s, Professor Tom Calvert attached the same type of resistors that I just struggled to say to the body and used the output of data to drive animated figures for choreographic studies. He used a type of exoskeleton, early form of it, which was attached to part of the body, and then he could position it so that the resistors could detect movement. Example where this would have been really useful is things like elbow. So the elbow would naturally bend. Getting that actual movement is a lot easier doing it this way. In 1988, Mike Gribble was used to engage viewers in a more interactive way. He played the role of Mike the Talking Head. So this allowed the users to have some form of basic conversation with a digital character. So it was almost like an early form of storytelling. Now, the responses were very basic as they were almost pre-coded. So it wasn't like an AI response as nowadays, but it was good for the time when that came out. Okay, so 1989, and this is the weird part, and yeah, I don't know what happened here, but a music video, Don't Touch Me, was released. This featured a digital performance of a singer named Dozo, and this used motion capture technology and also facial animation technology. So the setup used 8 infrared cameras set up in a circle which were raised up by about 10 foot. On the singer's limbs, they attached sensors which looked like attached ping pong balls, and they tried capturing the animation also of the hair swinging, but they didn't manage to achieve that. The technology wasn't good enough to actually capture that data properly. So to capture the data, they used motion analysis software, which at its time had limitations, and it only resulted in about 18 seconds or so of animation data. So for the video, they only had 18 seconds to work with. So when it came to the body movement, they had the same movement almost on repeat, but it would depend on what the singer was doing at that time. To capture the facial animation side of things, they went down the sculpting side of things, and they created many different sculpt faces for different parts of the song. Then using software, they could insert and change and synchronize expressions with what the singer's performance was. Okay, so we're moving on to 1989, and this was the year Prince of Persia released, and it utilized the techniques of rotoscoping, which we mentioned not so long ago within the history part. The creator of the game filmed his younger brother carrying out the actions that would be featured in the game itself. So this ranged from things like running, walking, jumping, fighting. Using the footage that he gained of his brother, he then drew the character animations himself. So this is one of the earliest forms of motion capture ever to be put into a video game. In 1992, Nintendo used Mario's head for promotional reasons. So they had booths set up with Mario's head, and it was there to promote the Super Mario franchise. The character would interact with people as they passed by, and the head was controlled remotely by a human wearing a helmet controller. Moving on to 1994, developed by Mirage and published by Time Warner Interactive, the game Rise of Robots was released. One of the most impressive features at the time was how it used motion capture for the character animations and how realistic for the time these animations were. This enhanced how fighting animations could look and feel. Now, the game itself received mixed reviews from both the player base and also critics, but regardless of that, this was the game that sort of pushed the boundaries into the motion capture side of things. So, in 2002, Lord of the Rings 2 Towers was released, and Gollum was just... It was so revolutionary watching Gollum be acted out and played within Lord of the Rings. So the actor wore a unique mocap suit with sensors placed on key parts of the body. This was able then to track movements, and it was easily translatable into digital data. To get the realistic facial details, the actor wore a head-mounted camera to track and capture all the facial movements at the same time. All the data collected was then animated using CGI technology, and then capturing all this data resulted in realism. So it really sort of like highly portrayed the detail of his character. The emotion. Gollum is a very complex character. He's got different types of emotion. He's got multiple personalities. This mocap style really enhanced and gave off that emotion even more, and it wouldn't have been possible if they didn't do that. And then the interaction with other characters themselves. Gollum's not just on his own all the time. He's actually interacting with Frodo and Sam, and being able to interact that with those characters at the same time was just completely beneficial to the whole thing entirely. Okay, so going back to games, from 2002 onwards, motion capture was starting to be used more in games, and it would make games more interactive and realistic. I'm just going to highlight some examples of ones that have sort of stood out in history. So you've got LA Noire in 2011, known for its more like facial motion capture data. The Last of Us was a huge game that relied on motion capture data because the characters had so much interaction with each other. Without that mocap data or mocap animation, I don't think the game would have done as well, personally. Other games like Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2, the general movements and interactions were of good quality, which was improved upon massively in the second installment of the series. And then the more recent ones I can think of are things like God of War, where both characters just play a crucial role in guiding you through the story and narrative, and it was really important to have realistic movement and animations to back up how intense it was and how story-driven that game is. Yeah, and then pushing into sort of like 2018, so not too long ago now, Epic Games pushed the boundaries of motion capture with their own game engine, Unreal Engine. In 2018, they showcased Siren real-time performance to the world. The term real-time meant that the performance was rendered in real time and not pre-rendered. This allowed for more direct interactions and adjustments during the presentation that they gave. So Siren was a digital human which was designed to be highly realistic and also lifelike. So to accomplish this, it had detailed face expressions and animations. Just this presentation alone showed the world what Unreal Engine was capable of and how powerful the engine had actually become. And side note, it's got even better since this point. Okay, so moving on to the next section very quickly. Why is mocap used in games then? We've covered the history. We know where it sort of like has come from. So why is it used so much in games now? Well, many games in this age are using some form of motion capture data to animate characters within said gaming world. Using data from actual actors in suits provides more fluid and realistic animations, which in turn makes the player feel more immersed into the world that they are actually playing in. Games naturally over the years have got graphically more realistic with how technology has progressed, and it's often a marketing point to show players how immersive and amazing this game is to play. However, if the animation side of these games were not done using proper software like motion capture animation, then the animations would just look so unrealistic and it wouldn't compare well to how good visuals are nowadays. A pure example of where motion capture data is very useful is in in-game cutscenes. In-game cutscenes are crucial on two things: great visuals, great animations. You use your cutscenes to sort of like progress your story, tell the story, show what's going on. It's important that this visually looks good graphically and animated wise. So to the player, it's almost like watching an animated show or like a movie or showpiece. If one side is lacking on the graphics or the animation, the player could easily pick up on that and feel less immersed in the world that they are playing. Games that have struggled with this at times is the Assassin's Creed franchise, where some of the more recent Assassin's Creed games have lip desync, where you can hear them talking, but the actual facial mouth movement is not matching up with what is being projected from the voice. And then from that, the player sort of feels almost disconnected from that universe because it's not as realistic as it should be. On the flip side, a great example is The Last of Us. This game has utilized motion capture to a great standard, and it's managed to create this sort of like in-game relationship between Joel and Ellie. And this wouldn't have been as impactful if that motion capture data wasn't there. So why is it used over the more traditional method of things before motion capture data? Well, traditional animation required an animator to go in and almost individually keyframe all the movement. Try get the movement as realistic as possible. But without motion capture, it doesn't matter how good of an animator you are, it's going to be really, really difficult to actually realistically get movement. Now, don't be wrong, it'll be possible, and it was possible back in before the motion capture days, but it's not the same, and you can tell the difference. Okay, so the next section I want to quickly go over is there's a lot of different types of mocap. Now, depending on what is being created, will depend on what type of mocap is being used. So there's a load of them, so we're going to go through them very quickly. So we've got what's called motion capture. And in this, you've got marker-based and markerless. So marker-based is a standard method where markers that are reflective are placed on parts of the body, and then cameras track that movement of the markers' positions in a 3D space. The data is then captured and replicated digitally. So an example game that has done this is GTA 5. So markerless optical motion capture uses computer vision technology to track movements without the need for markers. Cameras then view the subject's body directly. So another game example of this is Middle of Earth Shadow of Mordor. Next, you got inertial motion capture. So this system uses sensors that are attached to the actor's body. These systems can also be known as things like gyroscopes, not Skypes, and accelerometers. These sensors measure the changes in orientation and acceleration and position. Games like Call of Duty use this to capture realistic animations. Okay, next we got magnetic motion capture. This uses sensors that detect changes within a magnetic field as the target moves. These types of sensors are normally integrated into the suit itself. Next, we've got mechanical. This type of mocap utilizes exoskeletons or rigs to measure joint angles and limb movements. This method is used for more biometric and more medical reasons. However, it can be utilized within games if need be. So, for example, this was very good for games like Fallout 4 because there's a lot of robotic stuff in there. So, facial motion capture. So this is commonly used in video games to capture any sort of type of facial animations. And this is a key part of games that feature proper characters where they need to visually be seen speaking and interacting with other things. So facial motion capture is used widely across the board. You know, another one is hand motion capture. So self-explanatory, but hand motion, right? But this captures intricate movements of the hand and fingers, and this is mainly used for things like virtual reality, and also on a side things like sign language as well. So games on VR especially require some sort of hand motion capture because in-game you can see what your hand's doing as you're, in VR. Okay, next one, which is a very common one, full body motion camera capture. This type of motion capture just captures the full range of body movements. And this is used in things like games, sports, virtual reality. It's used widely across the board. It's a very common one. Next, you got real-time motion. So real-time is used for live performances in games. So this is set up so actors can see what movements they're performing live on screen. And then if they need to adapt or sort of like tweak something, they can do it without having to stop, review the footage, then go back and try again. They can do it on the fly. Wireless motion capture. So this type of motion capture takes out the need for physical cabling, which gives the actor more freedom to move around without having to worry about wiring. Also, games like Beat Saber use wireless motion capture to capture the input of the player as they're moving their hand with the controller. And then you've got high-speed motion capture. Now, high-speed motion capture is used for capturing rapid movements. Rapid movements could be someone sprinting. It could be faster than that. So it's used quite a lot for more things down the lines of like film and sports. Now, when it comes to games themselves, there's another layer developers have to consider when it comes to what type of mocap they use. And there's two types that they've got to think of. You've got animation-driven movement, and you've got script-driven movement. Animation-driven movement, this type follows the root animation fully. So this is used more for things like cinematics, cutscenes, because the animations are following core animation, and the player won't have full control over that animation. Okay, then you got script-driven movement. This type of movement is driven by code. Players within any game can have great reaction times, which can result in a full animation not even needed to be played. Movements will not be as visually fluid, but gameplay-wise, the player has more control overall. So this is important for fast-paced games like shooters and fighting games. So recording for this type of animation itself means reducing the number of actions that are not necessary to clean the animation up and make it less noticeable if the player was to make quick changes on the fly. Okay, so with all this information in mind, I want to have a quick look at a game that I've picked, so you can sort of like see how certain games do certain things. So I've picked one that wasn't really popular when it was first announced, and that was Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. This game specifically had one of the most disliked videos ever to release on YouTube at the time, and because of that, I don't think this game is really talked about that much. So there's not much information that people know about this game. Now, Infinity Ward, the developers behind this game, used a motion capture system called X-Sense. This was to capture all the character movements. So this system is well known for things like being precise and also its flexibility. This system uses inertial sensors attached to the actors' bodies. These sensors track the movements of the actors and translates them into 3D data that is then animated into digital characters. Using this process means real-time animation, motion capture, and reduces the need for post-processing. The X-Sense system does not need any markers to be placed on the actors' bodies, as this is purely done by just the sensors alone. Using such precision technology, the game outputs almost flawless graphics and animations. Every year, the Call of Duty series technology advances with each game and pushes the animation side further on each iteration of this franchise. For Call of Duty themselves, they are a AAA title, and they always strive for realistic looking graphics and animations, and they take pride in that and also promote it within their promotional side, as you would call it. Okay, so another area is future trends. I think it's no secret technology is advancing at an incredible pace. When I was a kid in the 90s to how things are now, it's almost night and day. Things have progressively got so much better since I was a kid, and it's only going to increase how much things change in a short amount of time. So things like real-time performance capturing, having animation data being processed and applied instantly to digital characters and objects is becoming more of the normal. This gives actors instant feedback as they're performing like movements or like interactions, and it gives them valuable information. Another thing is, I think it's no secret, AI. AI is getting scary good. So AI could be integrated into the motion capture side of things to help with things like post-processing, which then would reduce the amount of work that must go into the cleanup process and other areas. AI can also help with character animations and generating some realistic behaviors. And over time, this is only going to improve and make the current process even easier to output realistic animations. More options. When we think of mocap, we think of mocap suits in studios, for example. However, there's more options now where you've got more portable options like phones and wireless options, and so the everyday user can have access to this and try and create their own sort of motion capture stuff, and it's only going to progress more and more as technology advances in that area. Naturally, with technology, higher quality motion capture animations, naturally games, as I've said, are getting more graphically advanced, and also the same is going to happen with motion capture. So the output will feel more precise with things like facial expressions, hand movements, and small detailed movements will start getting a lot more realistic the further things go down the line. Just waffling. Okay, so here's the example I'm going to show you. So right now I'm looking through at the Xbox Connect camera, and I've set up the space ready. So I've got enough floor space. I've positioned the camera how I want it to be. So when you're doing the camera here, it's very important, if I'm doing full body, that the whole body is visible to the camera. Otherwise, there's going to be issues when it comes to the actual software itself. Another thing that you'll need to do, which I'm going to do in a second, is set the background. So as you can see here, it's not too bad now actually, but if I stand here and do that, you can clearly see that it knows where I am at all times. But just to be on the safe side, I'm going to get the background to automatically update just in case there's any issues. I'm going to evaluate the background. I'm going to stand out the way while it does it. Okay, so it's done that now, so now I can come back in and we're all set, ready to go. Okay, so what's important with this now is we're going to do an animation, and I'm just going to do a very simple animation from roughly about here, crouch down maybe, and go boom, like that. Okay, nice and easy. Very important that you keep your whole body within the camera at all times. And yeah, I'll give you a demonstration now. So to start it off, we're going to do a T-pose. This is how they all start. Okay, and I'm going to come down into a stance, and then boom, come back, okay, and then up, T-pose position. We're going to open this in Mocap Studio. Continue. And we're going to set my height, in my case 5'8", and boom, there we are. Okay, now we don't need to see myself standing here, not important, so we're going to turn that off. And what we're going to do is we need to align this up with this, but before we do that, we need to set the timeline. So I want to set it just before I make the important movement, so roughly about there. So we're going to bring this down to about 48. Same with this one. And then we're going to go on the same on the other side. About there. So 366. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to start off on frame 48, and I'm going to just align this up properly. Roughly about there, and then I just need to slightly rotate that down to about there. That looks good, and then all we need to do is come in here, and we just need to rotate these arms down slightly so they line up a bit nicer. Perfect. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to track forward, so it's going to track that every single position then up to the end. So hit track forward and it should follow and replicate it, which is doing right now. Perfect. So if I come back to the first frame and hit play, as you can see now it is copying and mimicking the movement that I have done. So all I have to do now, nice and easy, is come over to here and just add a character rig. So as you can see here, we got this weird looking thing that looks a little bit like Kyle, and then all I'm going to do is hit play, and it's now mimicking my movement. Now it's not perfect, because at the end of the day there are limitations to the Kinect itself. If I keep that on loop, you'll notice that some of the joints are sort of like going inside each other, and that's just because, one, it could be the lighting, it could be the fact that the Kinect camera is only one camera and it can't get every single angle of my movement, but you can see the basic sort of form of character animation using some sort of motion cap data right there. Okay, so with motion capture, there is naturally going to be advantages and there's naturally going to be disadvantages. So let's have a quick look into what is an advantage and a disadvantage. So we'll go over the advantages first. Most obvious one is it's going to take less time to animate such realistic animations, which is therefore more efficient. With this, you're going to have more detailed animations, so you're going to have more sort of like weightiness, so things like punches are going to feel a lot more realistic because it's an actual punch. Whereas if it wasn't done by motion capture, it could end up being a bit too floaty, it might not look as realistic. So this is where motion capture comes in to a good part. Another area of this for detailed animations is proper facial animation. So things like no desync when it comes to voices and the actual facial animations. I'm looking at you, Assassin's Creed, you need to improve it. Another area is capturing proper movements by the actors. Actors have their own set movements and set ways of performing certain movements and roles. Being able to capture that on a precise level is going to add so much more realism to it. When it comes to capturing non-human things, so like animals for example, it's a lot harder to actually pull that off, whereas using motion capture, it's just going to make that process a little bit more easier. On the animation side, it's just going to be more consistent with how the movement feels and how natural it flows. Regarding sort of like the cost side of things, it's becoming more cost effective for small teams and indie developers now to actually have their own motion capture technology themselves. This is great because it allows small teams to be able to finally create good looking games without having the need to have a huge budget and spend loads of money. This advantage again is great for if you've got a scene with multiple characters interacting with each other. Like for example, I spoke of Lord of the Rings earlier on. In Lord of the Rings, Gollum could interact with Sam and Frodo live. It's the same instance here where multiple characters can interact with each other at the same time, which allows flow and it's more natural. Okay, and then let's highlight some disadvantages with motion capture. First one, which is, I mentioned it being a positive, but it can also be a negative depending on what you need, is the budget side. Motion capture can be expensive depending on what you're actually after. And for a small team, you might need to stretch that budget further to be able to provide the animations that you want. Another section that people might overlook is if you're after a certain actor to play a certain role within the game, the cost for that is going to be high just on its own because you need to hire that actor. A huge part, which small teams might not consider straight away, is accessibility. You need to have the correct conditions to be able to effectively capture data. So you got to think of room size, lighting. You don't want to have like a load of reflections which can cause issues. You got to consider the calibration setup side of things. So accessibility is a huge one, and if you don't have that option of good sort of room size, for example, you're not going to be able to pull off all the animations that you want. Data cleanup. This can take time to remove things like noise, and if there's any issues or bugs, it's going to take time to go through and clear up some of this data that you need to actually adjust. And then another thing which is down to more the actors, but actors need to be able to adapt to motion capture if they've not used it for the first time. Doing something without a suit on, for example, is a bit different than having a suit on. So they're going to have an adaptation period where they need to adapt and get used to being able to use the suit.